Okay, Leon's going to tell us why the British burned their own hospital.
George was very interested in Adamant, Vermont, where I spent summers. And he has a satellite view of the place on the bio sheet. So I thought you'd like to see what it looks like from pond level. This was taken from Sodom Pond, and I want to make it clear that it was named that long before I came. This is our business district, which consists. Oh, okay. Yeah, that does sound better. So, I was going to say, this is our business district, which consists of a general store and a post office. And this is my house in February. You may be able to guess why my wife insisted that after 32 winters there, we need to move to South Carolina. This house was built about 1 year after Francis Marion died. And as it was being built, Hamilton and George Washington were working on Washington's farewell address.
From Vermont?
Pardon?
Their farewell from Vermont?
No. George Washington's farewell address as retiring president, in which he warned about regional factionalism and loyalty to party over country. And at that time, the United States was still very much an uncertain experiment, and perhaps it still is. The memories of the founders and the patriots who served were still fresh and hadn't been replaced by mythology, which surrounds Francis Marion, unfortunately. And then now people were trying to figure out what it means to be an American. What does the Vermonter who has a Bernie sticker on his Saab have in common with the man in South Carolina driving a Ford pickup with a Trump flag flying from the rear? What does it mean to be an American? What do we have in common? And I think the 250th anniversary comes at an opportune time for us to think about these questions. I don't have an answer, but certainly we can all start thinking about what it is we have in common. And certainly the people in this room have in common the search for what really happened during the Revolutionary War and not what is mythology. And one of the subjects that has given rise perhaps to some misconceptions in mythology surrounding Francis Marion is the burning of Fairlawn House, also known as the Colleton House, that was the home of Lady Colleton, which was used by the British as a hospital at the time it was burned. This is a historical marker in Monk's Corner near the location of the Fairlawn House. And I'll give you a few seconds to read that if you want to read the whole thing, but the main point here is that, I'm sorry, pushed the wrong button. The main point I want to make is there was a large brick house described as, of course, very magnificent. The other side of the marker explains the story I want to talk about. The property, Fairlawn Plantation, included Fort Fairlawn, which according to the marker was built, or started being built in April of 1780, and it was an earthworks, and I'll show you a picture of what they looked like a little bit later. And on November 17, 1781, Patriot militia under Colonels Hezekiah Mayhem and Isaac Shelby, on orders from General Francis Marion, attacked the outpost, commanded by Captain Neil McLean, and took about 150 prisoners. The house, used as a hospital and storehouse, was burned. Contemporary accounts, however, disagree on which force burned it. So I want to address the questions that are raised by these two highlighted passages. First of all, did the Americans or the British burn the Fairlawn house, the hospital? And if it was the Americans, did they know it was a hospital at the time it was burned? And if it was the Americans, was it done on orders from Francis Marion? The burning of the hospital came at a time when Francis Marion's reputation was at its height, perhaps the highest it was before Parson Weems got hold of him, and then, of course, Leslie Nielsen and Mel Gibson. Marion had just come from the Battle of Utah Springs, where he and other militia officers earned high praise from General Nathaniel Greene, who was not liberal with praise for militia, but he wrote to the President of the Continental Congress that General Marion and Colonels Malmedy and Pickens conducted the troops with a great gallantry and good conduct, and the militia fought with a degree of spirit and firmness that reflects the highest honor upon this class of soldiers. So the burning of a hospital by Marion certainly would have besmirched his high reputation at that time. After the Battle of Utah Springs, Greene sent Marion to follow Colonel Alexander Stewart, the British Colonel Alexander Stewart, keep pushing on that, from the battlefield during his retreat down to Monk's Corner. And then Greene himself followed part of the way and got as far as Ferguson Swamp, where there's a very narrow causeway. It would have been too dangerous for him to cross. Stewart, after he reached Monk's Corner, left a small force and his wounded at Monk's Corner, at Fairlawn Plantation, at the Collison House, which was used as a hospital and also as a depot for military goods. And then Stewart went back to 1-2 Plantation as a base from which they could raid neighboring plantations, Whig plantations, stealing slaves and also foraging. They had to help feed a large population of British soldiers and refugees in Charlestown. So they were very frequently, the British raiding in the neighborhood plantations. Greene then withdrew his main army, leaving Marion in charge of the area around 1-2 Plantation. Greene retreated to the high hills of Santee, where he got word that Cornwallis was in trouble in Virginia. Greene expected, I didn't do that, I wasn't anywhere near. Greene expected Cornwallis to retreat back through Charlotte, North Carolina, where he'd come up during what's called the Race to the Dam. And so he assigned Hezekiah Mayhem in charge of state cavalry.
Race to the Dam was long before this. Yeah.
Oh, no, yeah. But he expected Cornwallis to go back the same way he'd come up. Yeah, yeah. So he expected Cornwallis to pass through Charlotte, North Carolina. And he expected the assigned Hezekiah under Marion to be present to anticipate Tarleton, who would be expected to be in the vanguard of Cornwallis's retreat. By the way, these were state cavalry rather than militia cavalry, as the historical marker has it. Now, Greene also asked Isaac Shelby and John Sevier to meet him at Charlotte. Greene actually went to Charlotte, North Carolina, and sent a message to Shelby and Sevier to meet him there with their over mountain men. Over mountain men being over the Blue Ridge Mountains. These were used to fighting Indians in very close combat with rifles, tomahawks, and scalping knives. Many of them had participated in the victory at Kings Mountain. And in the previous December, they had burned the Cherokee towns and crops to make it safe for them to live on the frontier. And so they felt fairly safe in leaving their homes. It was harvest time, but the women could do that kind of work, and some of the children. So Shelby and Sevier, there were not men left from what is now Tennessee, Sullivan and Washington counties in those days. And they ascended the Blue Ridge Mountains as high as 4,600 feet. They were on horseback, but it's still quite a trek. And came down to what's now Morganton, and then passed through Ramser's Mill. Probably were reminded of the victory that happened there, the victory of the Americans over the British. They went too far, not too far from where Kings Mountain victory occurred, so they were probably familiar with much of this trek. Got to Charlotte, found out Greene wasn't there. Greene had learned that Cornwallis, of course, had been captured. And so Greene left a message, come on down and meet me in the high hills of Santee. So these over mountain men thought they were just going down within their own state as far as Charlotte, but they had to march even farther. On the way, they passed Waxhaws, where they probably saw the mass grave of slaughtered Americans who had been trying to surrender. Passed through the scene of the Battle of Camden, Gates's defeat, where the British had intimidated and routed Virginia and North Carolina militia. And by this time, the over mountain men are probably thinking, oh Lordy, what are we getting into? These are not the kind of people we're used to fighting. They come down to Hobkirk Hill, site of another American defeat, where Greene had been defeated by forces that included convalescents from the hospital, the British hospital. And then they got to Camden, and they saw the charred ruins of many of the buildings that the British had burned to deny it to the Americans. Well, that was at least something they were familiar with, burning the enemy's village. And then they got down to the high hills of Santee, and Greene tells them, keep on going. I get the impression from reading pension applications that they weren't welcome. They were probably a pretty rough-looking bunch of people. And Greene asked them to continue down another 50 miles to the swamps of Santee and join Marion in trying to suppress the plundering by the British. By this time, about the middle of November, Marion had moved his camp to Paris Plantation. And William and James described the location of Paris Plantation in Marion's camp as being about a quarter of a mile from the Santee River. And I think the location must be about here. This is the Santee River. This is the old Santee Canal, the Symp Canal, that connected the Santee River down to Cooper River. North is to the top on this map. And there was a planned town called Islington shown here. You've seen this map before, actually, today. Jeff showed a different version of the map. And I think this was probably the location where Marion had his camp. The rest of the area is pretty swampy. It formed a barrier between him and Wantu Plantation, the British, about 15 miles to the south. This is what the area looks like now, where they had planned to build the town of Islington. On the way to this site here, you pass Thomas Walter's grave. In fact, this is called Walter's Grave Road. Thomas Walter being the early botanist that Jeff talked about this morning. A very interesting site, would make it a wonderful park. Now, this map on the right is an overlay of Joseph Purcell's 1793 map made at the behest of the Colletons. The brown lines show the roads that are depicted on the map, and this is overlaid onto a current USGS topo map of Monk's Corner. Historic Monk's Corner would be located about here, very few houses. For point of reference, this is the modern tail race canal, and the old Symp canal is here. Neither of these existed at the time that I'll be talking about, 1781. The Fairlawn House, also known as Colleton House, which is used as the hospital, is located here and was protected, sort of, by a redoubt. And it's a little less than a mile away from Fairlawn House. The British were also at Biggin Bridge, which was over Biggin Creek, and a blockhouse was being constructed at that site at the time. Fortunately, Fort Fairlawn still exists, sort of. This is a photograph of some of the earthworks. You can just make it now. Of course, it's overgrown with trees. This is a rendition of what it may have looked like at the time. And there's a moat around it, and then this earthworks, and then a step for firing over the edge. At this time, the Fort Fairlawn was manned by Captain Murdoch McLean, with only 50 British soldiers. He had been in command of 150 Hessians, but the Hessians were deserting so fast they decided to send them to Charlestown. And he was left with only 50 soldiers to patrol a perimeter of a mile or so. And he warned Stuart that this detachment was so small he couldn't afford to spare troops to guard the hospital. And so the patients in the hospital were in charge of their own defense. Convalescents have to do duty there. Now we get to the raid itself. And this is, of course, the Mouzon map. This is Paris Plantation, where Marion has its headquarters. On November 15th, 1781, Marion orders Mayhem, Hezekiah Mayhem, with about 180 of his cavalry and 200 of the Overmountain men under Shelby and Sevier to go down to One-Two and either engage them, try to lure them out of the camp and have a battle, or intercept them on one of their patrols, and then to try to recover slaves that were going to be shipped from around Monk's Corner to Charlestown. Probably Mayhem left on the evening of November 15th. They generally traveled at night because there were spies all around and they wanted to keep the operation secret. This is one possible route he may have gone, down Nelson's Ferry, past Utah Springs battlefield. And then the next day, they arrived near One-Two Plantation and trying to lure the British cavalry out for a battle. The British cavalry was actually away at the time, so that part of the mission failed. So the next day, they come down to Monk's Corner in the hope of intercepting the slaves that are going to be shipped to Charlestown. But they had been shipped to Charlestown the day before. So that part of the mission also failed. And you notice here, this is from a report that Marion sent to Greene the day after the raid, and nothing in there says anything about attacking a hospital or burning the Colleton house. We don't know what Colleton house looked like then, but this is what it looks like now. Just rubble, broken bricks. When Mayhem showed up, he fired a few rifle rounds, and the patients marched out of the hospital, gave up without resistance, naturally. Almost 100 of the patients were put on horseback and sent back to Pierce Plantation, Marion's headquarters, some 50 miles. And then McLean's force from the redoubt, Fort Fairlawn, watched helplessly as Colleton House went up in flames. Mayhem arrived very early the next day on the 18th and reported to Marion. And then Marion wrote a letter to Greene reporting what Mayhem told him happened. And it says that Mayhem went below Monk's Corner to Fairlawn, where the enemy had their hospital. So at this point, Marion knew that there had been a hospital at Monk's Corner. This describes the prisoners he took. He knew there were 80 convalescents, probably 80 to 100 convalescents that had been captured. Some of them were released because they were too sick. And then they burnt Fairlawn House, which was being used to store arms. Now you notice that he mentions the hospital and Fairlawn House in two different sentences, so it's not clear here that on the 18th, the day after the raid, Marion knew that Colleton House was in fact a hospital, so he may not have known that Mayhem or some of the Americans had burned the hospital. But he soon found out because Stuart wrote a letter to Greene. He didn't lower himself to write a letter to Marion, who most of the British officers considered to be nothing but a leader of banditti. But he had his aide, Major John Doyle, write a letter directly to Marion complaining about the outrage of taking off a parcel of sick, helpless soldiers in a hospital and then burning the hospital. So after Green got the letter from Stewart, Green demanded an explanation from Mayhem, and Mayhem wrote to Green explaining what happened. He described Colleton House as a fortress, and indeed it was surrounded by abattis and perhaps looked like a fortress. And he described the prisoners as soldiers rather than as patients. Now, nothing seems to have come of this because the British abandoned Mook's Corners a few days after the hospital had been burned. And the only repercussion really was that MacLean had to give his version of the story. And thanks to Tim Stacy, we have a copy of those depositions that you can all read in the Spark article that Charles Baxley and Brett Bennett and I wrote up. Marion's report, they sent to Green, leaves little doubt the Americans burned the hospital. Mayhem admitted that the Americans burned the fortress, and now we know the fortress was the hospital. One of the pension applicants, William Simpson, also stated that at the taking of a fortification near Monk's Corner, in which there were 93 men and 3 women, that's interesting, were made prisoner, and they burnt the fortification. There are several other pension applications in which they say they burnt the building, but the people who say they burnt the building never refer to it as the hospital. They always refer to it as the fortification. The people who refer to it as the hospital never say that they burned it. Apparently there was some shame about that, or remorse. Now the question remains, was it on order from General Francis Marion? People spend about 45 seconds reading these historical markers, and at a quick glance you could very easily come away with the impression that the hospital was burned on orders from General Francis Marion. Is that true? It's not in the description of the orders that Marion sent to Green. Or could it have been Mayhem or Shelby? The marker here lists Mayhem and Shelby, but could it also have been Sevier? A lot of people have concluded that Sevier wasn't even present during this raid, because at the end of Marion's report to Green, he mentions Shelby as having kept his men in good order, but he doesn't mention Sevier. And so a lot of people, some people anyway, have concluded that Sevier must not have been there. But Marion says he certainly sent both Shelby's and Sevier's riflemen, and several pension applicants mentioned that Sevier was there, including Sevier's son, who certainly would have known and recognized his own father. He was one of a party of British outpost below Monk's Corner, South Carolina, consisting of about 100 men. They had fortified around a large brick tenement belonging to a Mr. Colleton, as well as who recollects. The officers commanding the party were Colonel Sevier, and then he goes on to mention Mayhem and the other officers. So Sevier probably was there. But not mentioned in Marion's report to Green. Could that be a hint that Mayhem had told Marion Sevier didn't keep his men in good order? Could he have perhaps lost control of his own men? Sevier, in fact, had written to Green just a week before the raid that he was worried that some of them were going to desert. And the reason they were going to desert was because they were about to be tried for stealing clothing, which suggests that they were not being very well provisioned. haven't found any evidence that Sevier himself ordered the burning. So who burned Fairlawn Hospital?
Leon, were there any patients in the hospital when it was burning?
No, well, as far as we know.
So
Or-
they didn't kill any patients by burning the building? That we know of.
That we know of, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So who did burn the hospital? Could be this guy. Or maybe with some of his friends. They were probably not very happy about having been told to go down to Charlotte and then finding themselves 500 miles away from home at harvest time in the swamps, away from the mountains and the clear streams. They probably felt that they were on an alien planet. And they were used to dealing with the enemy with fire. So maybe they decided to deal with the British problem in the same way they had dealt with the Cherokees. This, of course, is all speculative. But I think what we can conclude is that there's no evidence that Marion ordered the burning of a hospital. And we can say, however, that the Americans, or some Americans, did it. Whether under orders from an officer or not, we don't know. And I'd be glad to try to answer any questions you might have. I'm a little hard of hearing, so if you shout a question, I'll be okay.
We visited site and there's bricks there. What's the evidence of fortifications?
None now.
Any evidence, with all those bricks there, is anybody that's been there, and I have a little bit?
I think there are people here who can answer that question.
Yeah.
The Lord Berkeley Trust owns it. It's 80 acres on 2 different parcels. And the mansion was, there are descriptions of it, it was as big as Drayton Hall. This is the only grandson of any of the proprietors to actually live over here for a period of time. Of course, they're all named John, so you actually have to have a map in front of you.
There was a
But
James.
So this place was huge. There's tens of thousands of bricks on the property back. That is 3/4 of a mile from the Fort Fairlawn. It's guarding the storage thing that we saw down, the entrance down to the landing, excuse me.
But your question
Is there
is...
evidence there in a pile, like it's a defensive corners of a basement?
It's a brick mansion.
Yeah, I understand.
It's huge, which had many tenant structures around it as well. Tenements.
Nothing but rubble now.
It was surrounded by abatis according to several pension applications, so in that sense it was fortified, but of course wooden abattis wouldn't survive now, so there wouldn't be evidence of that. Probably the intact bricks were scavenged, so the rubble you see there now is probably only a fraction of what was originally there.
Currently, right behind the house, if you go in the woods, there's it's like a small ditch. And I read somewhere where they put brush or something around the house as a fortification. And maybe that swell has something to do with it.
Is there any LiDAR there? LiDAR?
Yes, there is LiDAR. The beautiful thing about the LiDAR is how Fort Fairlawn shows up.
Yeah, I've seen that, but
You're
I've seen
perfect.
the house part.
Yeah, and I can't make out much there, nothing distinctive. Purcell's map shows the outline of Culleton House. And I'm guessing that he was told what it looked like at the time. But I don't think anybody's traced the original foundation to find out what it was.
If you look at the ditch that this gentleman was talking about, it would, if you look at the ditch this gentleman was talking about, it runs right through where the house was. And my understanding is it's a drainage ditch and is post-revolutionary war period. But the pension applications that say that they were advertised, that's the way of saying that, around the house, makes it a fortified position. Now, having been in the JAG office of the United States Army. If you fortify a hospital, it loses its protective status. And then if you add to that, if you're keeping on the premises weapons, arms and ammunition, you're supposed to store those separately away from the hospital facility, you again lose the status of a protected place.
Yeah.
So, assuming all the sick and injured were removed, what was left is the building that's been fortified with the arms and equipment and military stores, which makes it a legitimate target.
That was precisely the argument Green made in his reply to Stewart. And you can read those documents in the paper that Charles and Brett and I put together.
Are we looking at this from a possibility of a war crime?
Well,
Or, you know, because it doesn't...
that's
you know, I
the
can't see-
impression that some people may have.
Because I can't see this in keeping with the humanitarianism of Francis Marion.
That's the whole point of my talk.
If we go back to Kings Mountain, and the Over Mountain men wanting to hang many more of the British loyalists that they captured, and Sevier and Shelby, although several were hung, as we all know, but far more were saved, from putting a halter around their neck by Sevier and Shelby.
May I make a comment? Dr. Walter Edward always says that we have to consider the time. What we would think is a war crime now, 200 years ago, may have had a very different meaning, because I don't think we had the treaties and all of that. So you always have to put an event in its time rather than the way we feel about it now.
Yes, but in Green's reply to Stewart, he says, he admits that this is not, I forget the exact words he uses, but you can read it in the report. He says it's not acceptable, but things like that have happened on both sides. Also, he points out that the correct procedure would have been for the British to hang a white flag on the building to indicate it'd be sort of like a Red Cross now. And also Green pointed out the hypocrisy of Stewart complaining about American cruelty when he still has American prisoners on the prison ships in Charlestown Harbor. So it makes very interesting reading back and forth. I do recommend you turn to the rear of that paper and read all about it.
But the Americans did evacuate the British wounded, who were eventually treated by, I imagine, American surgeons, American doctors.
Yes, but a wounded soldier being put on horseback for 50 miles is not exactly tender loving care.
So because the building was burned does not mean that an officer gave an order to burn it, okay?
That's right.
So, we're putting way too much into this. I know that we have to look at every angle, but the points that were made earlier, Isaac Shelby was the first governor of Kentucky. Sevier was one of the first representatives to the United States government by North Carolina.
And
They were not perfect men, but I know that they did not have it in their hearts to order the burning maliciously of a hospital.
Yeah.
So, I think, I'm being a little bit indignant here, but my point is that somebody's got to be a little bit indignant once in a while.
well, I imagine it may have been something like Vietnam, where hooches got burnt just by private soldiers because they were pissed off.
Yeah, private soldiers get pissed off.